Irina survives the attack on her caravan despite her helplessness. Later, she is apparently killed by Misbegotten, which triggers the appearance of Hyeira in Liurnia. However, it doesn't make much sense for her to have survived the first attack, or for the Misbegotten to go through the trouble of specifically targeting her afterward. But most importantly, that initial interpretation is further complicated by the fact that if Irina is killed by the player before the Misbegotten get the chance to do so, Hyeira doesn't show up. This implies Hyeira's appearance isn't simply linked to Irina's death, it requires Irina to die in a specific way. And another interesting note we can make here is that in the Weeping Peninsula, we also find the Shield of the Guilty. Guilty? Shield of the Guilty? Which mentions a maiden whose eyes were crushed by briars of sin before being reborn in these lands. Considering Hyeira is a finger maiden, that Irina's eyesight's been weak since birth, and that eye body horror is standard operation for the followers of the Frenzied Flame, seeking a finger maiden, this shield's history could be a hint that whatever's happening between Irina and Hyeira has actually happened before, that Irina herself may be the outcome of a previous rebirth we didn't get to witness. Now, given the death trigger and the shared models slash voice actors, one is clearly reborn as the other, right? Another simple interpretation with complications attached to it. Their bodies look the same, but they're literally two separate bodies. Irina's body remains dead on the ground, while Hyeira is walking around. Just as their demeanor may be similar, even though their personalities are distinct from each other. So, what gives? Well, first of all, let me remind you that, at least according to my theories, Miquella had created a grand alliance that included Mohg, Rykard, Rhea Lucaria, and eventually Godric. And as useless as Godric may be, he does play a role in connecting the subject at hand to that grand alliance via Irina's father, Edgar, who is a subject of and stationed at Morn under orders from Godric himself. Next, back to Irina's rebirth into a second body. That outcome is reminiscent of how primal glintstones work, where the essence of graven mages is transferred between host bodies, which is a very speculative connection at first glance, but it just so happens that, in the Weeping Peninsula, we can also find the Witchbane ruins, where Selen's body and primal glintstone are kept against her will and guarded by marionettes from the Academy, another member of that very same alliance, and that don't really have any business being in the Weeping Peninsula in the first place. So, now we have the primal glintstone setting a precedent of a rebirthing process with a similar outcome to Irina's. A rare instance of primal glintstone related lore, oddly located in the same region of the continent, and a tangential connection between all parts of the system through Miquella's Grand Alliance. This doesn't provide us with any answers yet, but it is a solid framework for a possible venue of exploration, right? Okay, so, as previously theorized, Miquella's plans included using Chaos in order to commit the first cardinal sin, granting him access to the Elden Ring without the assistance of Melina. Miquella's needle is capable of subduing the flame of frenzy if inherited, allowing one to cheat fate and avoid becoming Lord of Frenzied Flame. In this sense, the needle does ward against the meddling of other gods, yes, but it doesn't sever the connection to their power, which is demonstrated by the tarnished still being able to burn Hyera, still being... Hyera, yes. Demonstrated by the tarnished still being able to burn Hyera with the flame of frenzy, even after they have used that needle. In that same theory, I had also explained that Vaika had been used as a guinea pig by Miquella, having been compelled to receive the Three Fingers embrace, and then used one such needle himself, which ironically also severed Miquella's control over the night, leading to his imprisonment at the Lord Contender's Ever jail in the mountaintops of the Giants. Now, how is all of that relevant to Irina's situation? Well, as a finger maiden, Hyeta is functionally a tracking device that guides you to the Three Fingers. So, if Irina herself is the byproduct of the previous rebirth of a finger maiden, which is hinted at by the Shield of the Guilty, then Irina could have guided Miquella to the Three Fingers as well. This explains the convergence of all previous factors, and considering Miquella had already devised his needles at that point, as indicated by the note found on a member of the Great Caravan on the way to the Three Fingers, then Irina's connection to the Frenzied Flame could have been severed after her usefulness. After her usefulness was spent, and theoretically the influence of the primal glintstone inside her as well, just like Vaika left both the calling of the Three Fingers and the charming of Miquella behind. This more easily explains Edgar's willingness to contribute his own daughter to such a purpose, and Irina's non-finger maiden behavior when we meet her in her moment of peril. And as for Miquella, this approach allows him to keep the crystal safely hidden as a backup, while also creating a degree of separation from him, which is generally just a good practice in terms of operational security. Okay, so all of this explains Irina's role up to the moment when we enter the story, but not Hyera's role moving forward. The Alliance would have no reason to rebirth Irina as Hyera, and Edgar seems to strongly disagree with the death of his daughter, for obvious reasons. So, who rebirthed Hyera and why? Well, after Irina's death, Edgar goes to the Revenger's shack. There, we find the bodies of Miss Begotten around the shore, and dead nobles inside the shack, from which we loot raw meat dumplings. The first impression, I think, is that the shack is named after Edgar the Revenger, who killed the Miss Begotten, who had killed the nobles, and who were possibly eating their flesh. I think that's the easiest assumption here, right? But, like, Edgar probably derived his Revenger title from the legend of Castle Morn, mentioned in the Grafted Blade Greatsword, right? And the thing is that before Irina's death, that place, the shack, was already called the Revenger's Shack. That place didn't get its name from Edgar himself, it got its name from the same legend that inspired Edgar, which creates a pre-existing connection between the two locations, meaning that wasn't a random destination for those misbegotten. They didn't accidentally end up there, they chose that place. Something else that's weird here is that the Misbegotten had no reason and arguably no means of getting from Morn to the shack, right? I mean, think about it. The bulk of their forces are still holed up back in the castle, so it'd be much easier to go back there and join their friends rather than crossing the Bridge of Sacrifice and the rest of Limgrave and fighting their way all the way up to Liurnia with no help and a crazed fucking banished knight chasing them every step of the fucking way. Right? So, why the fuck did they go there? Well, the Misbegotten aren't the only ones that show up there after Irina's death. The nobles do that too. Before Irina's death, there's only one dead noble with no loot. After her death, there's a bunch of them with dumplings. So, if the Misbegotten chose that location as their destination, and if the nobles only appear when the Misbegotten go to the shack, then the implication is that those nobles were there to meet with the Misbegotten, right? It's a meeting. And this unlikely alliance also means nobles could have provided assistance for the journey from Morn to Liurnia, explaining how those Misbegotten managed to go that far in the first place. And if you're still thinking about the dumplings, I'd like to point out that none of the bodies in Castle Morn had raw dumplings on them, indicating that human flesh is not a part of a well-balanced Misbegotten diet. I mean, come on, they're not monsters, they're just different. If anything, given the circumstances, it's more likely the nobles were eating the dumplings themselves. And lastly, this alliance also provides a source for the knowledge regarding primal glintstones that would be necessary for the Misbegotten to kill Irina and trigger Hygeia's appearance, which is to say, the transference of her glintstone between hosts. Remember that Hygieia doesn't show up when Irina is killed. Hygieia only shows up when Irina is specifically killed by those Misbegotten. But why the hell would those nobles help the Misbegotten rebirth Hygieia, you might ask? Well, the followers of the Frenzied Flame that we meet in-game are mostly stationed at static locations, such as the Alien and the Frenzied Flame villages, but they do actively seek out maidens, and they do all provide grapes for them, implying there is an overarching goal shared by all of them. Just like the Tarnished have the guidance of grace, which brought us to the lands between and points the way to becoming an Elden Lord, the Frenzied Flame seems to be doing the same for its followers, guiding them down a path that would lead to the rise of the Lord of Chaos. Like, that's what happens to Hygieia, right? Chaos literally shows her the way. This is the meddling of outer gods that Miquella was worried about. Now, despite most followers of the Frenzied Flame being commoners, with a few afflicted trolls and soldiers sprinkled here and there, Shabriri's woe draws a direct connection to nobles as well, since the character creation describes it as the crazed likeness of a noble whose eyes have been gouged out. And with all that in mind, we can go back to the nobles in the Revenger's shack. It's easy to assume Edgar had been consumed by the Frenzied Flame, having gone perfectly mad, as the nearby spirit puts it, since we find a Shabriri grape in his possession. But think back to the fight against him. He doesn't have the flame of chaos spewing from his eyes like all other afflicted. He doesn't cast any frenzied flame incantations. He's just Edgar. So, given all previous connections, the fact Higuera only spawns if the misbegotten kill her, that they chose that shack as destination, that the nobles only show up if the misbegotten do, and that Shabriri's woe draws a specific connection between nobles and the frenzied flame, then the conclusion here is that the grape doesn't belong to Edgar. It belongs to the nobles, and Edgar just took it from them when they were killed. The nobles themselves were agents of the frenzied flame, and that's why they helped the misbegotten rebirth Irina as Higuera in a body, in a body unencumbered by Miquela's needle, because her goal is their goal, to bring about the Lord of Frenzied Flame. And after her rebirth, feeding her grapes reestablishes the influence of the frenzied flame, reinstating her purpose as a finger maiden. Okay, up to this point, we have explained Irina's original purpose, who rebirthed Irina as Higuera, why they did it, and also the discrepancies between those two identities. Now we need to explain the similarities between their bodies. And to do that, we're gonna talk about Shabriri. Finally, the man himself. We meet Shabriri in the mountaintops of the giants after he's taking over Yura's body. But why Yura? And why there? Well, the connection to Yura comes through Eleonora, last seen in the location where Yura dies and who, despite being a bloody finger, actually wields a frenzied flame seal. This is a very unique seal. You can't just buy that from Kale and his friends, which implies a deep connection to the followers of the frenzied flame. Yura's behavior and dialogue after the fight against the Ravenmouth assassin in Raya Lucaria even kinda makes me believe he was possibly being secretly groomed for this very same purpose of becoming a host to Shabriri. And the connection to the mountaintops would come, well, first and foremost through the Forge of the Giants, since that's where we're going to be using the Frenzied Flame should we choose to walk the path of the Lord of Chaos. But given the previously theorized connection between followers of the Frenzied Flame and Primal Glintstones, then should we entertain the possibility that Shabriri's presence in the mountaintops could indicate a connection to the Stargazer's ruins, also located in that same region, since that's where we find the Primal Glintstone blade, which would not only provide the source for the knowledge necessary for the Misbegotten and the Frenzied Flame nobles of the Revenger's Shack to have used a Primal Glintstone, it would also explain Shabriri taking over Yura's body, since a Primal Glintstone could have been used with them as well. Like, I've seen people assuming Shabriri can just do that whenever he wants to, that he can just take over other people's bodies, but there's no actual evidence of that. That's just something people will assume about the situation. But the Primal Glintstones set a precedent for this situation, since for an uninformed outside observer, the outcome is exactly the same. If anybody who knew Selen's new body back when it didn't have Selen inside of it, stops to talk to her after Selen's taking over, then from that person's perspective, their old friend who lived inside that body before Selen has been possessed by the Graven Witch. It's just like Shabriri and Yura. The DLC may even have provided even more evidence for this conclusion. Like, did you notice the bound and beheaded bodies in front of Midra's mens? Did you notice they have yellow crystals jutting out of their necks? Did you notice that despite their missing heads and the amount of time they must have been there, their bodies still bleed if you hit them? They aren't dead. They're alive. I think those crystals are a kind of primal glintstones and they're keeping those beheaded bodies alive. Now, all of this builds a pretty solid framework around the assumption, it's still an assumption, around the assumption that Shabriri may have been connected to primal glintstone blades. But it doesn't provide an answer to what that connection would be exactly. Right? Like, Shabriri taking over Yura's body functions in the same way that primal glintstones do. And he appears in Yura's body in the same location, in the same region of the continent where we find primal glintstone blades. But we don't know how those two could be connected yet. Right? Well, the thing is, we kind of have gone over the answer to that question already. Like, Miquella is the connection between Shabriri and the glintstone blade. Back in my theories about Miquella's researches, when I talked of soul grafting, I mentioned one of the branches regarding that subject likely involved the study of these blades. Now, Shabriri's role in the character creation says it's depicting a noble, and its proper item description says it's depicting Shabriri. So, both of them together are saying Shabriri was a noble, right? So, since Miquella had nobles counted among his ranks, even though most of them seem to be dead now in Elphael, and also the fact he probably worked with the Great Caravan at some point, judging by the aforementioned note they leave regarding Miquella's needle in the presence of the yellow onyx within Miquella's territory and Mohg standing right at the entrance to the conscription, then the most likely explanation here is that Shabriri, who was himself a noble, was once associated with Miquella as well. This would put him in direct contact with all the pieces of this puzzle. The glintstone blade, the academy, the location of the Three Fingers, and the identity of Irina, who would have led them to the proscription in the first place. Okay, now, let me ask you something. How does Shabriri know about Melina in the Forge of Giants? Have you ever asked yourself that? How does he fucking know that? How does Miquella know that even? Like, none of the other demigods give any indication they know about that. Enya, the Fingers, and Gideon down at the Hold didn't know about that, even though Melina's looking for Tarnished to help instead of demigods. Even the way Morgoth talks about it seems to corroborate this was a very, very well-guarded secret, waiting to be revealed at the right time to the right person. The Earth Tree wards off all who didn't approach. We are all forsaken. None may claim the title of Elden Lord. So, If nobody else knows about Melina in the Forge, then how do Mikela and Shabriri know about that? Well, I think we can answer that by adding another layer to Shabriri's history, another piece of his identity, which comes in the form of a very obscure, unassuming, and unexplored character, the Wandering Artist. So, the first thing to note here is that all the painting items we get are probably from a single artist, right? The game doesn't explicitly state that, as usual, but the great majority of paintings in the game can't do what those items do. The reminiscence, the puzzle, the reward routine, the other paintings don't seem like they don't do that. That doesn't look like something that's common in this world, right? It seems like something a specific artist was able to do. And the painting's descriptions say that this painter is said to have captured the landscapes seen during the last moments of those welcomed into death's embrace. The soul of the painter and vestiges of the dead's last moments can be discovered by visiting the location depicted even now. Which is to say, the painter captured the visions of people who died. But the painter didn't die, I mean. He made his paintings, left a manifestation of himself behind, and moved on. Now, the second thing to note here is that the fact he also made paintings in the shadow realm, depicting the crusade as it unfolded, implies he was embedded with Marika's forces, which is useful in regards to his paintings back home. His paintings in the lanes between can be found all over the fucking place. And there's no apparent way to discern any kind of order to them. But him being a wandering artist means said wandering probably started from his base of operations. And if he was embedded with Marika's forces, that means he was likely a noble from Leyndell, which would make Flightless Bird the first one to have been painted there. And that painting gives you Fire's deadly scene, which says, "The prophet despaired, looking up at the earth tree, for soon the kindling would burst into flame, bringing ruin. The burning of the earth tree is the first cardinal sin. That is not the domain of mere man." And this is just fucking perfect, right? Like, nobody seems to know about Melina's role. Hell, not even Melina knows about Melina's role at first. This seems to be the one secret Marika really kept a secret to the very fucking end. And what Fire's deadly scene is telling us is that the secret was actually kept. That there were no spies involved. The information didn't leak. But the cardinal sin involved the Flame of Ruin. And while the Flame of Ruin is anathema to the Earth Tree, prophets sometimes glimpse it within the faith all the same. This is how Shabriri learns about it. This was the best well-kept secret in the kingdom, but prophets are a loophole Marika couldn't control. She banished them whenever they were caught talking about the Flame of Ruin, but she couldn't stop them from receiving their visions. And Shabriri, the noble, the wandering artist, painted one of them. Okay, so Shabriri learned that the queen was planning to burn the Earth Tree. And what did he do with that information? Well, he started talking about it. Shabriri's woe says that he was punished for the crime of slander, without specifying what he said about whom, but telling people that Marika was planning light treason against the Golden Order seems to me like a surefire way to get yourself branded as the most reviled man in all history. And then punished for it, right? But that particular piece of information was of particular interest to Miquella, who took the now persecuted noble under his protection in order to learn what he could about this whole thing. And now that Shabriri was rolling with Miquella's crew, he kept doing his thing. He kept on painting. All the base game paintings seem so goddamn random, but they all become connected when you factor in Miquella's history, his Grand Alliance, and his plans. Homing Instinct is from Lingrave's perspective looking toward the Weeping Peninsula, which makes the peninsula the home in question, and represents Irina's original journey. Prophecy and Resurrection are related to members of the Alliance, Stormveil and the Academy, respectively. Redmayne needs no further explanation, I think. Champion Song is, well, that one is found in Shaded Castle, which is related to Mount Gaelmir, another member of the Alliance, and the painting is also related to both. Well, that painting is related to Vaika and Godfrey. Like, Vaika's involvement with Miquella was explained in this very same video, and the hero's grave depicted in the painting is in the same area where we find Lanceax and the Storm-Colored Church, and the Dragon Bolt Blessing, which is the base for Vaika's Dragon Bolt. So that implies this is where Vaika was abducted by Miquella in the first place. And regarding Godefroy, well, he is just not relevant for this particular theory, so that's something I'll talk about in a future video. Sorry, you're just gonna have to trust me for now, he's related to Miquella too. Future video, stay tuned, sorry. And lastly, the Sorcerer painting is related to Esgar and the Great Hood, which is something very specific I had mentioned right at the beginning of the Miquella Master Plan video. I had not expected to find any more connections to it, but here we are. And there you have it. This completes Shabriri's backstory. It explains how he and Miquella learned about Melina and the Forge. It gives us the previously missing lore regarding the Wandering Artist, and it finally gives us a framework to analyze his paintings as well. And lastly, since the Shining Grounds, from where Miquella freed Morgoth and Mohg, are Leyndell's favorite place to tuck undesirables away, and since their underground gulag isn't home to just the Omen but to human prisoners too, then I think it's safe to assume this particular criminal was shunned down there with the rest of them when he was accused of slander, and that location's proximity to the Frenzied Flame proscription would provide Shabriri with the opportunity to eventually become acquainted with the Flame of Chaos himself. And this, incidentally, also completes the picture for the very first thing we discussed in this video, since it could provide Miquella with the knowledge regarding the Three Fingers and the maiden whose eyes were crushed by briars of sin before being reborn in these lands, who is mentioned by the Shield of the Guilty, and whom I had theorized Miquella had rebirthed into Irina when he used her as a guide to the proscription and the way to reach the Fingers in the first place. Like, Shabriri is afflicted with the Frenzied Flame and is capable of receiving its guidance, but he isn't a Finger Maiden, and everything in the game points to only a maiden being able to guide you to the Three Fingers. The guidance they received would have allowed them to find the maiden they needed to find the proscription. The Great Caravan could have provided Irina with all the grapes she could possibly have needed, and ascending Vaika as the Lord of Chaos would have been the incentive they needed to work with Mikela. Before they were all betrayed, of course, with a final, somewhat speculative conclusion here that since I had previously theorized in the Shadow of the Earth 3 timeline videos that Marika would have used Nanaya, Midra, and his sect in the Shadow Realm for her own goals there, then it's possible that the Finger Maiden who was rebirthed into Irina was actually Nanaya herself, from whom Marika would have extracted the primal glintstone used in this whole process, and which she would have kept hidden in the event she ever needed Nanaya's services again. Which gives us an origin for everything we've talked about up to this point, I think, and a connection between everything too. And now, with this more complete picture, we can also see that the relationship between Shabriri and Mikela was more cyclical than a straight line, right? There's a very dynamic plot going on there. They end up kind of inadvertently completing each other despite their competing goals, and they end up trying to undo each other's plans as well despite their previous alliance and their shared connection to the Frenzied Flame. I know this isn't like traditional writing or anything, but I think this is good writing from Miyazaki and his team, in my humble and completely biased opinion, right? Okay, so now we have found an origin for the primal glintstone stuff we had been talking about. But while primal glintstone field rebirths can transfer souls, they don't affect the physical host body. That kind of rebirth is reserved for larval tear field rebirths, implying a similar technique was possibly used to transform Irina's new host body to look like her old one. Right? The primal glintstone explains how she gets transferred to a new body, but why do they look the same? And in order to untangle this one, we're gonna have to go back to Yura and Eleonora. Eleonora, being a frenzied flame seal wielding bloody finger last seen at Yura's place of death, creates an intersection between Shabriri, the followers of the Frenzied Flame, and Mikela's Grain Alliance, which includes the Academy of Rhea Lucaria. And since Renala is currently transforming Sweetens using larval tear field rebirths at the Academy, and since Shabriri painted the Resurrection painting, which gives you both the Juvenile Scholar set and a larval tear, then he would have knowledge of just what the fuck was happening with all those shape-shifting students. And with all these pieces in place, they could procure larval tears directly from the Academy, which is possibly further corroborated by the presence of Yura there, and probably way easier than having to go spelunking in the Eternal Cities, right? But why though? Why go through all this trouble? Like, we have explained why go through the trouble of rebirthing Irina into Hayeta as a Finger Maiden, but why use larval tears to make their bodies look the same? Well, their plans regarding Irina don't seem to have been set in stone from the start. They seem to have tried a number of different approaches. They tried feeding grapes to a Grace Finger Maiden, likely kidnapped from the Purified Ruins, in order to make her a Chaos Finger Maiden, but that doesn't seem to have worked. The fact they left Irina alive after they attacked her caravan also implies they had planned to use her as their maiden, which also wouldn't have worked, given she likely has a Mikela's needle, which in turn must be very hard to extract from a living body that isn't falling apart from the rot. The purified ruins Finger Maiden was likely rebirthed with a larval tear to look like Irina, so they could leave her behind and avoid having people looking for her. But since they couldn't use Irina, they transferred her crystal instead. Then, since she looks like Irina now, Hayera's escorts likely left her behind to draw Edgar away from her, explaining why she's found all by her lonesome self. Alright, I know it's a lot of moving parts, so up to this point we've looked at the kinds of rebirths. Sorry. We've looked at the kinds of rebirths that fit the dynamics between Irina and Hayera, namely primal glintstones and larval tears, which we used to establish who would have rebirthed them, by which I mean the followers of the Frenzied Flame, exemplified by the nobles in the Revenger's Shack in Shabriri, with the help of the Misbegotten, and we also surmised why they did it, meaning the guidance they had been receiving from the Frenzied Flame itself in order to give rise to a Lord of Chaos. And of course, we also built a framework around all of that, that would explain how all these parts come together, with an added note that the location of all three known Frenzied Flame havens in the lands between correlate to the members of this plot in its various stages, meaning the Yellow Annex in the consecrated snowfield for Miquella, the Frenzied Flame village in Liurnia for the nobles, and the Ailing village in the Weeping Peninsula for the Misbegotten. And after all of that, there's still one small final piece to this puzzle that relates to the larval tears we just talked about, and that can possibly give a little more context to everything we have explored thus far. So, we've talked about the Misbegotten, right? But Lingrave has another group of outcasts fighting Godric's forces, the Demi-Humans. A number of them show the ability to disguise themselves as fauna, which could be mistaken, which could be mistaken as mere camouflage, but box dialogue in Japanese explicitly states he was magically transformed into a tree. Against his will. That's not just camouflage. Now, when the Demi-Human's transformation takes place, a puff of smoke is released, of the same kind we get when larval tear-dropping enemies switch between forms, like when the crayfish transforms into a grafted scion, for instance, which in turn implies that the Demi-Human's shrub magic is fueled by larval tear technology. And the question here becomes, where would they get that? Well, we already have the Ailing village as an example of Frenzied Flame-afflicted commoners that just don't give a fuck about hierarchy in the Weeping Peninsula. And we also have the Misbegotten with a connection to the followers of the Frenzied Flame rising up against their oppressors in the same region, which creates a pattern with the Demi-Humans as another persecuted group following the same revolutionary path in that area, which then makes their connection to larval tear technology the same connection between the Misbegotten and the primal glintstones, the followers of the Frenzied Flame. They're going around stoking fires everywhere they can get them started, it seems. And that's it. The whole story behind Irina, Hayeta, and Shabriri. And here, at the very end, I must say that contrary to how the ruling class would have them portrayed, There's nothing actually crazy or chaotic about either their methods or their goals. The followers of the Frenzy Flame, they're resourceful, highly organized, seemingly imbued with class consciousness, and the Song of Despair is as haunting as it's beautiful. They're not demigods or Empyreans. They don't have the means for taking power or fixing the system. When you push people hard enough, don't be surprised when they start to push back any way they can. And if you take away their hope, don't be surprised if they decide to burn the whole world down around them. Hello, everybody. Okay, so first, at the end here, there's something I wanted to try. Like, I'm going to try and be answering some questions that my patrons leave for me sometimes. And one of them asked me about Miquella after his ascension. They asked me whether Miquella would be a a god of love or compassion. And I think the question itself is interesting because neither, the answer, neither, but the question itself is interesting because that's an example of a tendency we all have of projecting our own biases and social constructs and ideas into the story, into the characters and the events of the game. Like these outer gods and the powers they control, they're just powers, right? And these outer gods only seem to be interested in having power. And the powers they control are just powers. Different kinds of power source, but they're all just powers. Like grace is associated with enlightenment and compassion, right? We get that visually, we get that culturally from the culture they built around it, from America, the way she presents herself. But the rule of grace is also like in practice, the rule of grace is also associated with slavery, exilement, torture, genocide, and the tarnished killing themselves 1,000 times over and over again while killing literally everything that fucking moves around them. So grace isn't that graceful. Grace is just a name, and this image that we have of grace is something we project onto it. It's something that inhabitants of the game, the characters themselves, project this image onto grace. And then that is transferred to how we see grace as well. Right? The same thing goes for Miquella. The outer gods they're not associated with this kind of concepts, love or compassion or hatred or anything like that. You know, like Americas associated in grace are associated with life and bounty, but they're also associated with death, right? There's the list I just mentioned, and returning to the Earth Tree is the greatest honor of all. Like, they love death in the lands between under the rule of grace. And grace can kill you just as easily as any other power source, while destined death was associated with death, but it just kills you, you know, it's just a power source. And the Frenzied Flame and its followers, like, it's branded as Frenzied Flame, it's branded as Chaos, but they're all quote unquote chaotic, right? Like, the rule of like Golden Order doesn't actually establish order. It just establishes a system of control. And likewise, chaos is and grace is searching for power and the outer god that controls grace, and the Lord and chaos also wants power just the same way, and it's waging war and it's killing, it's destroying, just like grace does, just like all the other powers do, right? Why isn't Rot chaos? They set off a fucking nuke in Caelid. Why isn't Rot chaos? Right? I mean, of course, rot stuff, but you get what I mean, I think, I hope. And like the Frenzied Flame, Chaos, and its followers, they're branded this way because they're disruptive to the status quo, they're disruptive to the system implemented by the ruling class, right? Like a real world comparison could be anarchism, right? In colloquial terms, when people say anarchism, they mean chaos, right? It was anarchy. When they say that, they mean chaos. But anarchism isn't a synonym, isn't actually chaos, right? Like, anarchism is a political system. There's a whole philosophy there, right? People study it. People develop a system of thought. But it gets branded as chaos because it's too disruptive to all the other systems. Capitalism hates anarchism. Communism hates anarchism. Everybody hates anarchism except the anarchists, right? Because anarchism seeks to eradicate the kind of hierarchies that are necessary for most other systems. There's nothing chaotic about it. It's just a different kind of order, right? And the same thing goes for the followers of the Frenzied Flame, which is relevant to the theory today. And the same thing goes for Miquella. Miquella isn't a god of love or compassion. Miquella is just an outer god, right? Okay. Regardless of what Miquella may say, just look at their actions, okay? Yeah. That's it for the video today. That's the question I wanted to answer today. I'm testing out a new model, as you can see. Hope you like it. And I think I may have rushed a little bit through the explanation of the theory, but I wanted to keep it under an hour. And I'm doing away with all embellishment and frivolous stuff, like no narrative, no nothing, just data, just theory, just lore, right? I want my theories to be as clear as possible. Maybe I rushed a little bit through it, I could, but it should be easier to follow this way. I have started doing that since the Miquella's master plan video, right? And let's see how it goes. The diagram is there, hope it helps. And yeah, thank you all very much for watching, as always. A very big thank you to all of my patrons as well. Sinclair Lore, Balam, Liu Vampire, Sam D, Hubal, Taylor Reed, Medium Hat Logan, Derp, Devo, Brain Douche, Mr. Pudding, and Kyle Van Reaper. Thank you all very much for your patience, as always, for your support as well. And yeah, there's a few more videos coming. They're all ready to go. They're all available on Patreon. I'll be dropping videos about once every month, right? And until next time, Stay safe, and I'll see you around. Bye bye.